My name's Thomas Allen Moon, and I'm the author of Payback: Why the Top 1% Must Invest in the Rest and How It Can Renew America. I wrote Payback to deal explicitly with an ongoing trend that politicians of all stripes have refused to admit exists. Over the last 40 years, the gap between what it costs to live the American dream and the market income of ordinary workers has widened from a gully to a canyon. This canyon now threatens the future of the middle class, and if nothing's done, Americans with ordinary skills will fall out of the middle class. Payback proposes a tax policy that will enable capitalism not only to save the middle class, but to grow and make it more prosperous. Since Payback digs deeply into the weeds, I've recorded this Q&A to give readers a quick take on it. To make the Q&A easier for readers to digest, I've divided it into 15 sections. Payback is free to read on a website that I've created for the convenience of readers. It's my hope that Payback will contribute to a national dialogue on tax policy that I believe will take place sometime in the next decade. Now let's get started with the Q&A. Part 10. The normal income tax is an old idea whose time has come. Question. So what's the normal income tax? Well, when thinking of the normal income tax, think of words like simple, pure, and uncorrupted. Congress created the term normal income tax in the Budget Control Act of 1974 to describe an ideal income tax. The normal income tax was created to be a benchmark in which the Treasury Department and its Joint Committee on Taxation, known as the JCT, could measure the economic and revenue effects of what it called, quote, tax expenditures, close quote, and report to Congress annually on its findings. Tax expenditures are just another name for what I call tax preferences. The two are the same. Stop a moment and explain why you use the term tax preferences instead of tax expenditures. It's a matter of focus. Congress focused on the revenue lost by certain tax provisions, while I focus on the fact that these provisions confer special benefits on preferred groups of taxpayers. My concern isn't just that these provisions lose revenue. It's that they divide taxpayers into two groups, winners and losers, with the winners and losers being chosen by politicians instead of markets. Now please explain what the normal income tax is. The normal income tax is contemplated by Congress, taxes all income the same, has a progressive rate structure, and allows only a standard deduction applicable to all with no other offsets or deductions of any kind. The normal income tax regards all tax preferences as abnormal and doesn't allow any. You mentioned a requirement for annual reporting on the economic and revenue effects of tax preferences. Explain more about these reports. The purpose of these reports is to determine, in the case of each tax preference, what its effects on the economy are and how much revenue it loses compared to what would have happened under the normal income tax. It was hoped that this report would subject each tax preference to scrutiny by showing both the harm that they do to markets and the revenue they lose to discourage their continued use. Even though the JCT and the Treasury annually report in detail what the harmful effects of these tax preferences are, only a few policy wonks outside of Congress pay any attention to them. You've explained what the normal income tax is. Now explain how tax preferences first erode the progressivity of the income tax and second, lose revenue. Since 1992, the IRS has published annually a report that details initially concerning the top 400 taxpayers and after 2014 for the top 1,000% of taxpayers, their sources of income, the tax preferences they used to reduce their taxes, and the taxes they paid. One big statistic in these reports proves my case, and many other statistics in these reports show how harmful these effects are in terms of relative equity among various groups of taxpayers. What data proves your case? In 2017, the 1,433 taxpayers in the top 1,000th of percent on average had an adjusted gross income of $179 million and paid taxes at an average tax rate of 24 1/10%. Had these taxpayers paid tax under the normal income tax, their average tax rate would have been at least 36%, which would have resulted in them paying about $21 million more in taxes than they paid. No other taxpayer group benefits as much from tax preferences as those at the very, very top. As proof of this, those in the top 1%, other than the top 1,000th of a percent, had an average adjusted gross income of $6.3 million and paid taxes at an average tax rate of 27.74%, or 3.64 percentage points higher. Taxpayers should ask themselves why a taxpayer whose income is $179 million should pay taxes at a rate 3.64 percentage points lower than one whose income is only $6.3 million. Now I got time for a few more stats. Have at it. Further proving that tax preferences take much of the progressivity out of the personal income tax, 7.2 million taxpayers in the 80th to the 75th percentile whose average income was only $90,000 had an average effective tax rate of 18.63%, or 5.17 percentage points less than the top 1,000th's 24.10% effective tax rate. In 2017, the personal income tax rate schedule included rates ranging from 10% to 37%, giving the appearance of progressive rates. Tax preferences, however, make a mockery of the apparent progressivity of the rate schedule. Most damnable of all is the comparison of the 15.3% payroll tax payable on every dollar of income earned by hamburger flippers versus the 24.1% tax payable on income by the top 1,000% of taxpayers. Americans should ask themselves if it's fair or wise to tax hamburger flippers among the poorest of the poor deeper into poverty while taxing the richest of the rich at a rate only 8.8 percentage points higher. Remember, there's a 27 percentage point spread in the rate schedule between the highest and lowest rates. Tax preferences enable the top 1,000th of a percent to add to its surplus capital while making hamburger flippers ever more dependent on taxpayer-subsidized social insurance programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps, just for survival. You've shown how tax preferences erode the progressivity of the personal income tax. What about its effects on revenue loss? In 2019, the Congressional Budget Office, that's the CBO, estimated based on JCT reports that the 200-plus tax preferences lost revenue in an amount roughly equal to 7.8% of GDP. That amount just about equals the amount of revenue raised by the personal income tax. Step back for a moment and think about the fact that tax preferences lose about as much revenue as the personal income tax raises. If you'll indulge me, I'll show a few more stats that will put in perspective the magnitude of the revenue loss caused by tax preferences and who benefits from it. Let's start with the top 1%. Had the top 1% paid the normal income tax with a top rate of 37% instead of the current income tax, they most likely would have paid $212.7 billion more in taxes, or an average of $148,000 more. About one more stat. Since 1981, America's had four major tax cuts: 1981, 2001, 2003, and 2017, none of which were self-financing, and all of which added to the national debt. When the practice of indulging in debt-financed tax cuts began in 1981, the national debt was less than 40% of GDP. Now it's over 100%, and it's headed much, much higher. From 1980 through 2014, in constant 2014 dollars, the top 1%'s household wealth grew by $21 trillion. And not so coincidentally, the national debt grew by $15.3 trillion. Tax preferences that especially benefited the top 1% explain how much of the top 1% surplus capital in the national debt simultaneously ballooned. This concludes Part 10.